students, welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday. Today we are actually studying Monet. We did for the Mental Health Monday, we did the water lily study, the color study. And so today I wanted to do a Monet Impressionism styled landscape. And while Water Lilies was his most famous painting, I wanted to do something a little different flowers that are my favorite flowers. And so I was like, well, why wouldn't I do tulips and like a field of tulips? And I had this all planned out and I Googled field of tulips painting, and Monet had like a whole series of tulips in Holland paintings that I wasn't even aware of. I'm sure I learned about it in some art history class in college, and clearly it stuck with me. And maybe I should have even taken an art appreciation class to have it stick with me. I mean, what is that? What is art appreciation anyway? I'm pretty sure nobody appreciates art more when they're done with it. Does anybody take a math appreciation class? I don't think so. So anyway, I came across the fact that actually Monet did a tulip field scene, many. And so I was like, well, that's fine. I'm going to do it anyway. I don't want to recreate what he did. I'm going to create my own. And I came across a photo that I'm going to be using as my inspiration photo. And I'm actually going to combine 3 inspiration photos. I'm going to change up the sky on this one. So the sky's colors aren't necessarily going to be these colors. I'm going to keep the composition though, okay? So I'm going to keep it, the sky in the top 2/3, the tulips in the bottom. I do love having this windmill in there. And then for the tulips, I'm gonna change those colors up, and instead of it being monochromatic, which means it's all the same color, I'm gonna change it into a rainbow color just because rainbows have really been speaking to me these days. Rainbows are a symbol of hope. And I want to have this painting as a memory for me when I look back on these times that we were quarantined at home, couldn't go to school, had to do lessons from home, and I want to remember that. So I'm going to change up the colors in the fields as well. So that's going to be our painting that we're going to do today. Speaking of art appreciation, as I was, okay, so a really quick lesson on the difference between Impressionism and Post Impressionism. Impressionism is the time period when Monet was a painter, and Post-Impressionism was a time when Van Gogh was a painter. Both happened to be in the 19th century in France, and both of them were painters that wanted to get away from the realism. They wanted to get away from the historical figures. They wanted to get away from the mythological creatures and the mythological figures, and that realism that was seen widely before those times of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. So here's some key differences. When you look it up, it says that Post-Impressionism was in response or a reaction to Impressionism. Super hopeful, not helpful. So digging a little deeper, Impressionism also was painted outdoors, and we see that with Monet's water lilies, Monet's tulip fields. Who knew? Those are all, he set himself up outside and he painted outside. Now, for today's tutorial, I'm not going to be painting outside. We live in Washington. It's raining. I'm not doing it. But that doesn't mean I couldn't. I could definitely go outside, but I'm going to be an Impressionism-like painter in my studio today. Post-Impressionism painters actually were studio painters. They painted inside of their studios. So that was another big difference between those two. So I'm going to be like a Post-Impressionism studio painter painting Impressionism style painting. Other big difference between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, Impressionism focused on color and the use of color as opposed to lines. Whereas, and they did a lot of light studies and focused on how the light changed colors. In fact, Monet, if you look at his series of water lily paintings and you start them and line them up from when he was younger painting all the way until he was older, that actually told scholars that he had a degenerative eye disease, and it caused him the colors to change, and his paintings changed because of it. And I find that super interesting. Okay, so Impressionism focused on light. They did a lot of light studies and colors, Whereas post-impressionism, they used color as emotions. They used really vivid colors and they used abstract colors. So the colors didn't necessarily represent the reality of what the color that they saw. And Van Gogh did a lot of this as well. So the color was differently used as well. Okay, that's your little lesson on Impressionism versus Post-Impressionism. You're welcome. I hope you appreciate art now. Okay, so let's get started on today's painting. Now, like I said, I'm going to be using this as my inspiration. And one of the biggest things you'll probably notice is that I am painting a landscape in portrait. Why? Well, I wanted to change the composition and I can. I'm the artist, I get to decide. First things first is I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to, just like I did on my other painting, is I'm going to just really lightly sketch out where those lines are for my painting. Now, this particular picture has 1 point perspective, and what that means is there is one particular point where everything kind of is going from that. And so when we look at something that's farther away, like the windmill, it's going to be a lot smaller because it's in the distance. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that I get that perspective piece in there with the windmill. And there's a little bit of a barn here that I can have in there and some trees. I really don't want to spend a ton of time working on that background. We'll get to that later. But I do see that my camera angle has like right here as my perspective point. So my lines of my tulip fields are going to come out from there. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to draw my lines of my perspective because it's all going to be coming from that same area. I just want a basic general idea of where those lines are. So you can see that my lines are all coming from, when we make our 2-point perspective, we have it all comes from that general area. Now that I have my field, my perspective lines, how I think that I want them, when I paint, these will just give me a basic guideline of where I want everything. Many of you came to the high school to get your Blick paints from me, so you each should have gotten, if you came to get your supplies, you got one of these full of acrylic paints. You also got one of these palettes, which is really awesome because it even has a lid, and so you can keep your colors in there, and that way you don't have to waste those paints and peel them off since if they dry out overnight. Keep it in that cool little palette. Take the lid off the next day. Make sure you don't put it on as tight as that. Oof, that's not very friendly. Okay, so we'll be using our palette this way. And you also got 4 brushes, just like this. And so we'll be using those in our painting today as well. Okay, so here are the colors that I'm going to be using in my palette today. I didn't put any browns or blacks in there. I can go and add those in if I want to, but for now I'm just going to use this as my palette for today. Okay, let's get started. I am going to start in the sky. I always like to start my landscape paintings in the sky. Those purples and pinks and blues. Those really are some of my favorite colors, and I just love how they work together, and I love what that sky looks like at night as the sun is going down. So there's going to be just a really small amount of yellow that comes up from it, but I'm actually just going to be using my own kind of imagination, looking at my inspiration photo with where I should put some of those colors, but I'm going to be replacing them with color. marked a stopping point with my sky, and you can see that I completely went a different route. As I was going along and the colors weren't really working how I wanted them to work, I just decided, you know what, I'm just gonna go with almost just the colors and start streaking colors through and bring kind of the oranges up into the purples, into the blues, to give it that sunset effect. Just like in Impressionism, I wanted the impression of the sky, an impression of the sunset. I didn't want it to be too realistic. And so I just started taking my brush and going sideways along the sides there with the picture, with my sunset and those colors. And it was a process, but I made it work. So I'm gonna let that dry, and then I'm gonna come back to it. And I'm gonna start working on the tulips that are happening down in the tulip fields. And like I said, I'm gonna be using those colors in the rainbow. So we're gonna see kind of the rainbow that comes up into the sky and get the rainbow that's down here in our tulips as well. And use the greens, some of those dark greens in there. I'm probably gonna start with that and get those separations of the tulip fields that way. And just like in my sunset painting, the last thing that I'm actually going to be painting on is that horizon line with the farmlands. Yeah, you can't even really see my windmill anymore. You can't see it anymore, but that's okay. I know where it is. And so I'm going to paint my windmill, the little farmhouse, a few wispy trees, and the horizon line in the background. And then I should be pretty much good to go with my painting. I can see some areas up in my sunset or in the sky that I want to go back over, which I will end up doing, but as for now, I'm just gonna let it sit and dry, and then I can come back to it later. Okay, we're back. So my canvas has pretty much dried, and I actually went through on the bottom and figured out where my tulips were gonna go with all these crazy lines that I created at the beginning. And so the next thing that I'm gonna do is in the areas where I don't have tulips, I'm gonna be painting kind of a darker green, and I think I'm gonna get my brown out. There's two different browns in our kit here. We have a burnt sienna and a burnt umber, okay? And so I'm gonna be using those two browns in the non-tulip areas, although on the sides, you're not gonna necessarily be able to see the brown dirt. It's mostly just gonna be in this very front area right here. And then these side areas are gonna be mostly, there's gonna be some browns, but it's gonna be mostly some greens where those stems are. So just a little bit on that. And yeah, it's Impressionism. So I'm just gonna be using my brushes to be giving the idea of dirt, and much like my sunset picture where I had my dock and then I had the water underneath the dock, where I decided to kind of do different brush strokes. So my brush strokes are going to look different down here. And you can kind of see I got some paint down here while I was trying to hold it. That's okay. Again, I'm gonna just cover all that up with acrylic paint anyway, so it's gonna go away. You're not gonna be able to see these pencil lines. You're not gonna be able to see any of that stuff. So it's all going to disappear. Where I have tulips, I'm actually going to be using my two different greens. This is phthalo green, and this one is green light permanent. So I'm going to be using those two greens in the areas of the tulips, and then I'm going to go over, once that dries, I'll go over with the lines of the tulips of the colors that I want. And I've laid it out as well. So I'm going to have some pink tulips up here, some red, some orange, yellow, blue, green, purple, and then pink up again up in there as well. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. You see, I can just take and just do some really short brush strokes in there, and I'm gonna come back over with that dark brown. I'm gonna start with a light brown first and just really kind of do, this is almost Van Gogh like, honestly, rather than Monet. But like I said, the idea is that you're giving the impression of those tulip fields, and I'm not going to make it so that it's perfect. It's just going to be just really almost abstract. The Impressionism and Post Impressionism were really the leaders, the co-founders of the modern painting world, and the painters paved the way for that abstract painting to come to be, because they started getting away from the realism and getting into, like I've been saying this whole tutorial, the impression of. So I'm going to give the impression of the dirt in the field, this tulip field. And I'm very much like Van Gogh in that I like those vivid, brilliant colors, whereas Monet had really subdued colors. If you actually look at his tulip paintings, he has some really just dull, natural colors, whereas my eyes really go to those vivid, bright colors. So that's why my painting looks bright and vivid. So I'm gonna just come over with that dark umber on the top of it to give the dirt some more depth. And it kind of looks strange right now, but once we start to get those tulip beds in there and then the tulips on top of that, it's going to make more sense. And it's okay if your sky horizon line kind of crosses over, or your brown paints cross into the area of where your tulips are going to be planted. That's all okay, because what's going to happen is when we paint that farm, the windmill and the farm and the trees in the background, that's all going to get covered up. So no problem. So like I was talking about at the beginning of this is all dirt in here where these are going to be our tulips. And so this turns into the green stems up above this brown area in here. It's going to turn into those green stems. So I'm not going to worry too much about getting it all brown, because when we look at it with our perspective, we're going to see the sides of it are now going to be green. From here on out, it's going to be green instead of brown. So these are our last areas really where we need to get those brown areas in there. So I have tulips, tulips, tulips. So now what I'm going to do is go in with my greens and do some light greens in there. Especially I'm going to go into the greens. Honestly, I could even just paint the rest of this where you see white canvas. I could just paint all of that green. But I do need to keep in mind where each of those lines are. So I might leave a little bit just so I have an idea of where I want those tulips to start and end. Those pencil lines are super helpful so that I kind of have an idea of where I'm going, where I've been, where I'm going, so that I can add in the greens where I want them to. A great way to tell whether or not your paint has dried is if it's shiny. So this paint over here is still pretty shiny. It's not as shiny in here, so I can tell that that paint is definitely dried some. So I can go in and get those greens into this middle area here. And when I put my tulips in here, what's going to happen is I'm going to use a smaller brush. So, and I can still kind of see where I wrote tulips yellow. And I probably, yep, I can see those purple marks in there with this light green. It is kind of a transparent green, but that's going to disappear when I put that darker green over it. And then when I go ahead and put the yellow paint on it for the tulips, all of that will disappear. And you can see with my brush strokes, I'm just letting the flat part of the brush touch the canvas, and I'm just kind of dabbing up and down using that flat side of the brush, almost getting some of a texture of that paint that is, it's not going to lay flat. You can actually touch it and feel it. I'm not going to right now because it's wet. If you decide that you only want this green and you don't want to put any other green over it, but you don't want to see those pencil marks underneath, all you're going to have to do is put another coat on, and that's going to take care of that for you. So I am going to just let that sit for a little bit, let that dry before I add in the dark green on top of it. Then I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to add in each of the tulip field colors, let that dry, and then I'm going to add in the horizon line. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take my green, my phthalo green, and I'm actually going to mix it with the lighter green and get kind of a nice mixture between the two of those. I might even add some glaze in there as well. And I'm going to now just come into what I can see as almost stems, where I get some darker stems within these tulips. And this is, yes, it's a thinner brush than I was using before, but again, I want those thinner lines to be in the background. You know, the lines to get thinner as I'm farther away, so I'm going to make sure that I come back and use a thinner brush for the farther away ones to keep with that theme of that perspective the same. So it's starting to come to life a little bit. You can see those stems in there. And I'm going to wash this brush off, and I'm going to pick up an even skinnier brush. So I'm going to pick up the smallest one, get some more of that green paint, and I'm going to mix again that dark paint with the light green paint and a little bit of the matte medium so that I can get those stems in there as well. So I'm going to stop there and let it dry again. And then I'm going to go in and paint my colors. But before I paint all my colors on there, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to paint some white to get those vibrant colors. So when I come back into my painting, I'm actually going to be painting white, almost tulip bulbs on all the fields. And then I'm going to come over with my colors so that I get a more vibrant color. Now, if you wanted to paint in the style of Monet and again get those muted colors and those organic colors that he used, I'd just go ahead and paint over it with the regular color that you were thinking. But I mean, I can give you kind of a little bit of a spoiler. Yellow is our lightest color, and so if I were to come in here with just my yellow in this general area, it would work and you could see it, but there's a lot of green that comes through. And I don't know, maybe I'll think on it while I'm letting it dry and see if I just want to let those yellows, if I want to get the white on there or not. I haven't decided yet. We'll see. Maybe I'll just paint. Maybe I won't paint white. Maybe I've made up my mind. Alright, I'm going to let it dry so I don't get any green on it. So I am ready to get my flowers on to my painting. So I'm gonna add a little bit more paint, a little more yellow, a little more orange, a little more of this red and magenta. I think I need some more blue as well. It's not magenta, it's crimson, but in my world it looks like magenta, so that's what I keep calling it. Okay, so I am going to be using a smaller paintbrush. Maybe if I can find it. And I decided that I'm just gonna go over it like I started on here without putting down the white. I think I like what it's doing. If I want some white ones in there, I might put some white ones. Sometimes tulips have white striations in them, and that's pretty cool. It looks pretty great, but for now, I'm just going to paint my little tulips in here, happy little tulips, without putting my white down. And as you can see, there's no real rhyme or reason. I'm just putting paint down on the canvas and going in and trying to be as random as I possibly can. Because if you start to get too patterny in there, then it doesn't really get the gist of it. It doesn't give you the idea that it's organic and that it's nature that you're painting. And so I'm really just trying to come in and create some organic shapes with my brush and trying to be as organic as I possibly can and as random as I can, although it is something that I struggle with. My brain wants to pattern it and put it symmetrical and space them evenly apart, and so I'm really fighting with that tendency right now. So once I finish this, I'm gonna move into my orange and my reds and all the rest of the colors of the rainbow with my fields. And I'll come back to you when it's time to move into the horizon. You're gonna see me come back into this orange area with white. I didn't like how dark the orange appeared on the green, so I am going to use my white technique on that one, and I'm probably going to go back into my blue as well and get some white and blue mixed together just to brighten that up a bit as well. So that is what you're going to see. I have completed my tulip flowers. So now I'm going to be making my horizon and my windmill. So I'm going to start with my windmill, and I can see that I drew it just in this general area here. So I am going to be using brown paint instead of black, just because I really don't want to have it be so harsh black in the background. So you get kind of the basic gist of the shape here. While I let that dry before I get any of the other windmill parts to it, I'm just going to go ahead and draw my horizon line. Paint, I guess it is what I'm doing. Every painter, every artist should sign their work on the front. And there you have my Monet inspired tulip fields with some Impressionism, some Post Impressionism. That is my painting. I hope you enjoyed this week's Tutorial Tuesday. We'll see you next week.